Hi everyone, thank you all so much for tuning in for another episode of Hidden Gems. Today, another composer who was also a fantastic violinist. We had previously Zai and Chrysler, and today Grażyna Bacewicz, a Polish composer from the middle of the 20th century, who is most well known in fact for large-scale works, chamber works, symphonic works, but has also a wonderful collection of short works for violin and piano that I think is really worth getting to know, which is the point of this whole series. So, we will have later on a discussion about Bacewicz with the extremely knowledgeable Marek Zebrowski, who is the director of the Polish Music Center at the University of Southern California. But first, some music. This is the Slavonic Dance by Bacewicz, a piece that starts with a slow but brief introduction and then goes into a short and very lively Slavonic dance. Slavonic Dance by Bacewicz, and now a discussion with Marek Zebrowski, director of the Polish Music Center at the University of Southern California, and we'll be back with some more music very shortly. Thanks. Okay, and joining us now is Marek Zebrowski, who's the director of the Polish Music Center at the Thornton School of Music at USC. Thank you so much
for joining us today.
Good evening, Itamar. It's my pleasure to thank you for this wonderful idea to play a Bacewicz program and to talk about this extraordinary woman who is a great favorite of mine, although I never met her.
Yes, and you say extraordinary, and there are quite a few things that are extraordinary about her. I thought to start just by giving our viewers, listeners, sort of a bit of just the scope of her writing. She has quite a vast output, even though she lived for only 60 years, I think. So maybe you could put that a little bit into perspective for us.
Well, she was an incredibly prolific composer, and she loved to write. She was very intense at everything she did. I think she wrote about herself a little bit in her quasi-autobiography called Znak Szczególny, The Birthmark, where she gives a little vignettes from her life. And in one of those vignettes, she says, "I'm the person who has an internal clock that must be running much faster than anybody else's clock. I walk fast, I write fast, I do everything fast, and I'm exasperated with people who are not fast or cannot keep up with me. In fact, I ask them to borrow their spare time to give me some more time so that I could do things." That gives you a sense of what kind of an incredibly intense personality she was. I actually dug up a quote from an interview about her composing habits. And she said, "I think to compose, one has to work very intensely. One has to pause between composing different works, but interruptions shouldn't be made when you are in the middle of writing a piece. I'm capable of working on one composition for many hours daily. Usually, I take a break in the middle of the day, but even during the break, my brain keeps on working. I like to get very, very tired. It's sometimes then that I suddenly get my best ideas."
Yeah.
That sort of gives you a sense of this lady. She started composing very early. As you know, she came from a musical family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Her father
Yes.
was a musician, and the minute 4 kids were born, 2 men, 2 young boys, and 2 girls, he wanted to have a string quartet. So he started giving them lessons practically from the minute they were born. The other 2 brothers were both composers and pianists. She performed with Case, with her brother. And you know, the piece that you were doing, the Oberek,
That's right.
even on the YouTube.
Yeah, I really recommend everyone who's watching to check out this YouTube videos of Bacewicz and her brother playing this Oberek together. She's a real virtuoso.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she stands there just going away like a champ, real champ. And her brother, they're perfectly, you know, spaced together, and they're perfectly matched. They, of course, gave premieres of all of the violin and piano sonatas and other music, and so they were close as a family. They were close as a chamber group, and they were close as very talented people. I mean, she was a polymath, really. She
Mm-hmm.
was a violinist. She was also a fantastic pianist. She played world premiere of her 2nd piano sonata, which is not for the faint-hearted. So,
right. There's a Christian Zimmermann recording.
Yeah, Christian Zimmermann recorded that. She also was an author of many books. I mentioned already Znak Szczególny, The Birthmark. But she also wrote detective novels, which only recently were published. Can you imagine?
Okay.
And she wanted to study philosophy. And she was already prolific. I mean, the first 2 string quartets that she wrote, she didn't even number. That was in the early 1930s as she went to Paris. So he started numbering her string quartets from the 3rd. Her first official string quartet is really her 3rd string quartet.
I see. And the time in Paris, is that when she studied with Nadia Boulanger, or?
Yes, that was those quartets that were not numbered were written in the early 1930s. She went to Paris twice, in 1932 and in 1934. She studied also with Karl Flesch, who apparently tormented her rather badly. But, you know, she performed Wieniawski violin concerto at the Wieniawski competition and got a second prize. Ginette Neveu was the grand prize winner. So, you know, she competed against the best in her day. I mean, when you think of Ginette as a performer, that's incredible. I mean, you know, so she could have easily been a touring virtuoso violinist, which she was. And she loved traveling. I mean, it's clear from her memoirs that she loved, you know, going to India, going to Northern Africa, going all over Europe. And she had lots of anecdotes from concerts and how, you know, her shoes were once too tight, how her accompanist and she had little races who could dress more quickly for concert, you know, and he was beating her all the time. And she actually trained herself to, you know, get out of the train, get into the hotel room, switch into concert clothing in like 5 minutes flat. And she thought she would be winning that contest, but her Czech accompanist, a Czech pianist, would already be there, his tails and not a hair out of place. So, you know, it was great fun. It must have been wonderful to tour with this woman because she must have been a life of the party. And you know, and she liked performing. She liked to connect with the audience through her music. She hated talking about her music. It's rare that you know, that interview with Kisielewski that I quoted, that she actually spoke about you know, composing and spoke about being a musician. She really was very recalcitrant and did not wish to be interviewed by too many people. In fact, in that autobiography, she wrote, I don't want to talk about the process of composing. It's a discrete matter. So.
Interesting. And how did she divide her time between concertizing as violinist and composing? Was it in different periods set for D2, or did she do the two together at the same time?
Well, you know, she did so many things all at once. I think early on in the 1930s, before World War II, she was chiefly a composer who also, you know, studied violin and performed. But she also played as a concertmaster at the radio orchestra, which was conducted by Fittelberg, a great composer, friend of Szymanowski. And I think Szymanowski, there were two composers who figured large in development of Bacewicz as a composer and in the development of her language, musical language. And that's Szymanowski was first, and then also Bela Bartok. I think when you listen to her music, you will see a lot of, especially Szymanowski's late music, his piano mazurkas, Harnasie, the ballet, Stabat Mater, and those pieces that Szymanowski wrote in the last 10 years of his life. They were influential for Bacewicz. Then came the war. And, you know, it was a tremendous upheaval. They fled from Warsaw. She fled with her family. They escaped being bombarded by German planes in the Warsaw suburb, just south of Warsaw, as they were fleeing the German invasion in 1939. And so after the war, she emerged as a composer by, you know, presenting the works that were written during the war at a composer's concert. But she was also, in 1946, invited to perform Szymanowski's violin concerto with Paul Klecki and Orchestre Lamoureux. So that was a big gig, and she toured with that quite a bit. And I think her career as a performer sort of stopped in 1954 when she was in a car accident. She was the only person in that car that had pretty serious injuries. Of course, then she tried to joke about it, and I can tell you that story too.
Sure, yeah.
But you know, her performing career basically stopped in 1954, around that time, right after that car accident. And after that, she was invited to the juries of many competitions, violin and composition competitions. And she started writing more and getting more commissions and also prizes. Her fourth string quartet was awarded at the composers competition in Liège and a few other places. So she was really getting recognized in the early 1950s as a substantial composer. And then, you know, around 1960, she tried to experiment a little bit. Her last two string quartets, number 6 and number 7, are much more abstract, and they are partially also using the 12-tone technique. Mm-hmm. She did not like the technique that much because she thought it was really limiting in terms of harmony, but she used it in a kind of free way, adapted it to her own needs. And you know, there are some very interesting works. There is the Quartet for 4 cellos, which is a dark and very interesting piece. Then there is the Viola Concerto, which is her last work, really, written in 1968. And those are the Concerto for 2 pianos, which dates from 66. So the 60s were basically her last period where she tried to find a new, more abstract and more contemporary language. That could be also that she was encouraged by the Warsaw Autumn Festival, which started in Warsaw in 1956. And it really brought Polish composers up to speed in terms of, and also encouraged them. There was also a political thaw. So composers like Lutosławski and Penderecki, as well as a little later on Górecki and Kilar, came of age basically by being performed at that festival. And, you know, the music was allowed to be more abstract. Mm-hmm. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, before Stalin died, Bacewicz had huge problems, as many other Polish composers, by having to adhere to the folk style in music. Mm-hmm. So as you will perform the Oberek and the Slavic or Slavonic song, mm-hmm. It was also called in Polish utwór słowiański. So it is like Slavic or Slavonic. I would say Slavic rather than Slavonic, but let's not quibble about it. That Slavic piece has a quotation from a drinking song, a very well-known Polish drinking song. So I'm sure it was humorous and the audiences could hear that. And it was a much more direct quote than Chopin's mazurkas, which never quote any folk melodies, and yet they're unmistakably Polish. The same thing for Szymanowski's mazurkas, written 100 years later after Chopin, basically. But, you know, her music and music of many other Polish composers from post-war period until about 1953-54, after Stalin died, you know, those years were the years of socialist realist music that was kind of oriented to be more tonal, more acceptable for the masses, and so on and so forth. Well, you know, the same problem was faced by Shostakovich and Prokofiev and, mm-hmm. and other composers elsewhere. So
yeah, but she also chooses, it's not only the musical language, which, I mean, I do think it sounds modern, even though, you know, it's very accessible. I think she also chooses forms and, string quartet, violin sonatas, and multi-movements works, which are very sort of classical.
Yeah, they are neoclassical works, no doubt about it. She felt comfortable with it.
Yeah, exactly.
And she used those forms later on in the 1960s when she ventured into a new language, new kind of harmony, new world of sound colors. But of course, you could argue also that her playing in the radio orchestra and touring with the radio orchestra, she was the principal violinist, the concertmaster of the Polish radio orchestra, and toured with them in the late 1930s, just before the war. That gave her a tremendous lesson on orchestrating and writing, and balancing the colors. So when you think of such pieces as the music for strings, trumpet, and percussion, which is one of her big success stories, you can see that that comes from her experience, and of course several symphonies that she wrote. I mean that is directly related to her job as a concertmaster of the Fidelberg's Radio Symphony Orchestra, Polish Radio Symphony Orchestra, from 1936 to 38 or 39.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was wondering also if we could talk about those. You touched a little bit on the Oberek, on the specific pieces that I'm playing today. So maybe about what is an Oberek, because mazurka I'm familiar with that, but Oberek I haven't seen many, so maybe you can.
Right. I mean, but actually, Oberek is a form of a fast mazurka. There are three types of mazurkas. They come from central Poland. Mazovia is the region around Warsaw, and that's where the name mazurka is taken from. But just the northern part of that region has a dance called kujawiak, which is also in 3 beats per measure, 3/4 usually, and it is a very slow, kind of a mournful mazurka, often in a minor key, whereas Oberek is in 3/4 or 3/8, and it's a very fast kind of a spinning dance with accents on 1 and 2 or 2 and 3, and those accents shift, and so of course there is a great deal of playfulness there. Those accents are also present in the mazurkas, but they're in a slower tempo, so it's not as all hell breaks loose kind of situation. Obereks are fun to play, and they're fun for the audience because you can really get lost in that hubbub of activity. So that's the Oberek. Now the melody that you're playing also, all those works come from the late 40s and early 50s. But the melody is much more French, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Doesn't it sound to you almost impressionistic in at times?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's funny. I've noticed, at least from the pieces that I'm playing, while the main melodic line might be, maybe not complete, quite tonal and almost, and very direct. Underneath, there is always very, very interesting harmonies, always some chromatic line going down. So that's the case in this one too.
And I'm sure that as a terrific violinist, you appreciate the way she writes for the violin, don't you? I mean, all of those pieces are written to make sure that the instrument sounds to its full advantage.
We're back. We just discussed the Melodia and Oberek with Marek Zebrowski, so it's quite fitting that we play those now. So first the Melodia, and then, without further ado, also the short but very exciting Oberek. Melodia and Oberek by Bacewicz, and now back to Marek Zebrowski, and we'll talk a little bit more about her writing for strings, and not only the violin, string quartets, violin concertos, and we'll be back with some more music at the end of the conversation. Thanks again for tuning in.
She knew how to write for strings. Any string quartet. I mean, my great favorites are the middle string quartets, the third, the fourth, the fifth. Also the violin concertos. I mean, did you ever play any of her violin concertos?
No, unfortunately.
Look them up.
Yeah.
They're good pieces. And again, you will find a very neoclassical structure. It's always three movements. The last movement is always a fast. Sometimes it has this element of dance, or it's rondos and with nice couplets, and it's imaginatively written. It's certainly good music, and it's well worth your effort. So
yeah, and in Poland she is extremely well regarded. It seems to be, right? I think her statue is amongst sort of like the main Polish composers.
Yes, I mean, she is really recognized, but Poland had a lot of women composers. I mean, it started with Maria Szymanowska, no relationship to Karol Szymanowski. She was greatly very impressive as a pianist and a composer. She performed from memory. She was born in the 1780s and died in the 1830s. Goethe was in love with her. She knew Pushkin. She was the pianist to the Empress of Russia in St. Petersburg. Her daughter married a famous Polish poet, a romantic poet. So, this woman wrote mazurkas and polonaises and Polish dances already at the beginning of the 19th century. And Chopin used to come to her concerts, and I guess he was inspired by her because he wrote very little about the fact that she, pioneered the genres of polonaises and mazurkas and nocturnes that Chopin would later use. And 19th century, had a few women composers in other countries as well. But during the 20th century, we had besides Bacewicz a number of other composers. All of them are on our website. I can send you a list of the names. They're
Especially if you can mention a few. If you can mention a few, it would be interesting.
Well, there is of course, besides Bacewicz, there are more contemporary women composers like Elżbieta Sikora and Joanna Bruzdowicz, Hanna Kulenty, Lidia Zielińska, and the younger still women composers include Eva Trembacz, for example, who is active in Seattle. I mean, there's a number of great women composers, and they're doing very interesting works, pioneering work. Some of them, I mean, Elżbieta Sikora, who has lived in Paris for many, many years, had done a lot of electronic music and avant-garde music. So Joanna Bruzdowicz wrote a lot of film music. She worked with Agnès Varda, the French Nouvelle Vague filmmaker. So, but she's also a kind of a traditional composer in the sense of writing concertos and string quartets and sonatas. Mm-hmm. In fact, I found another quote when she talked about the car accident and how she recovered from it. And she said, "I wasn't doing well, especially during the first 2 weeks. There were even some critical," she puts it in quotes, "critical moments. Just then, I was defended by a wave of sounds obsessively reverberating in my head. The opening of Bach's F minor fugue, always the same. It was a thread I grasped at desperately in order not to be taken to the other side. Once already, when I was in a bad state, the same music was saving me. I wonder how it will be in my last moments. Will she and I be true to each other?"
Okay, wow. That's quite
Pretty
amazing,
spooky, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the music that ran through her head, the music that saved her from being ill or helped her recover, that I think is an insight that would be a wonderful insight for any performer doing Bacewicz. Don't you agree? Mm-hmm. This person who lived music, breathed music, and died with music running through her consciousness.
And with this rather poignant quote by Bacewicz, we'll come to the last piece on this program, Witraz, Stained Glass Window. Written earlier, in 1932, in fact, when Bacewicz was studying with Nadia Boulanger in Paris. And this is quite different, a very impressionistic and very, very striking work. And without further ado, this is a Stained Glass Window by Bacewicz. Stained Glass Window by Grażyna Bacewicz. Thank you for joining us for this rather special program, and hope to see you again next time. Thank you to Liza, and thank you very much to Marek Zebrowski for all this wonderful information. Thanks.